Making a diagnosis with the aid of laboratory guidance is a process involving patient assessment, pre-analytical steps, including sample selection and collection, the analytical phase where the laboratory carries out their diagnostic algorithm, and then the post-analytical phase where laboratory results are interpreted in the clinical context of the patient. Today, we're talking about the diagnostic process. When evaluating a patient, a herd, or a flock, the problem-oriented approach is a useful strategy for integrating patient history, laboratory findings, and physical exam findings into a complete picture such that you're able to make a diagnosis. And this forms the first stage of the diagnostic process. Once a list of differential diagnoses has been compiled, the clinician has to decide, is an infectious process going on, and which differential diagnoses are most likely. They then come up with a strategy to confirm or rule out differential diagnoses in the pre-analytical phase. Here, appropriate specimens are selected and collected. The laboratory is provided with all relevant information. Those samples are shipped to the laboratory, and the lab accessions those samples and selects the appropriate tests based on the information provided by the clinician. The lab then carries out their testing algorithm and comes up with a preliminary report, which can then be integrated back into the patient assessment. A secondary set of tests are then selected and conducted, so bacterial identification, susceptibility testing, etc. Those tests are carried out according to the laboratory algorithm, and a set of final laboratory results are reported and interpreted by the veterinarian. Those results are integrated back into that problem-oriented approach to come up with a diagnosis. So the process is actually much more complicated than simply sending a sample to the lab and getting an answer. Those points outlined in red here are all stages of the diagnostic process, which are entirely dependent on the clinician. Next, we're going to talk about principles of sampling, because this is something that I think is frequently underemphasized. The first thing we need to be aware of is that we have to obtain our sample from the actual site of infection while minimizing contamination. Now, this might sound really obvious, but in the case of an abscess, for instance, it's actually much more diagnostically beneficial to culture the margins of the abscess where viable organisms are more likely to be present rather than the purulent material in the center. And what you'll find is that as you familiarize yourself with diagnostic labs, they provide really good information. Here we have a screenshot of the recommendations from True North Veterinary Diagnostics for performing urine culture and susceptibility testing. They require liquid samples of urine, so you can't submit a swab. Cystocentesis is required. The sample has to make its way to the lab as quickly as possible. And if the urine can't be sent to the lab right away, it needs to be stored in the fridge. Samples need to be collected at the correct time. So you need to be cognizant of the lifestyle of your pathogen. When is it most likely to be shed? This is a screenshot of the product insert for the canine parvovirus antigen test from IDEXX. And what you can see here is that canine parvovirus is typically shed at the highest levels from day 4 to 7. And so if you collect a sample either before that or after that 7-day window, you're likely to have a false negative test. You need to collect a sufficient but not excessive quantity of sample. Think about the tests that you're going to be requesting and how much sample is actually required. It's also important to consider whether excess sample can be stored without loss of integrity or if it's simply going to end up in the garbage. This is another area where it may just be best to consult with the lab. Make sure to use an appropriate sample collection device. Particularly for culture-based assays, that sample must be sterile. And so use containers that are actually designed for sampling. Some products actually include inhibitory substances that may interfere with certain analyses. We can have inhibition of the growth of certain types of organisms, for instance. So remember, garbage in, garbage out. These are absolutely not appropriate. So urine in a Ziploc bag or feces in a knotted glove. These are difficult to work with, they're hazardous to work with. And when trying to get the sample out of these containers, it's really difficult not to contaminate the workspace and other samples that the diagnostician is working on. So just don't do this. We have a wide variety of sample collection devices available. One piece of occupational health and safety advice that I would like to share is not to recap your needles. Needle stick injuries are very, very common. And although serious consequences are actually quite rare, we can see really nasty infections, even resulting in like finger amputations. So think about your future career, think about how much you need your fingers to do surgery, and avoid doing this. If you do have to recap your needle, use sort of the one-hand scoop method where you aren't actually holding the needle cap with another finger, or use forceps to hold the cap. Dispose of the needles in a sharps container, an appropriate sharps container, immediately after use. Don't overfill the sharps containers. You don't want to be sticking your fingers in there to push everything down. And then finally, don't walk around with needles. When you're done using it, dispose of it appropriately. Make sure that your samples are handled and stored in accordance with what you actually want to be testing for. So, can that sample be frozen? Is special transport media required? All of these are questions that you should be thinking of when collecting your samples. And what you always need to keep in mind is, what is your analyte? What is the lab actually going to be looking for? And what method is going to be required to detect the target? So if you're looking for live bacteria and you want to be doing culture, you may handle that sample very differently than if you're looking for instance, parasite-related structures, and they're going to be identified microscopically. DNA or RNA detected by PCR, ELISA-based assays, looking at tissue structures by histo, or doing differential counts or biochemical analysis are all going to have different requirements. So check with the lab. Generally speaking, for bacteriological and mycological cultures, you don't want to freeze your samples. If you're going to be doing non-propagative tests, freezing is possible. So here we're talking about things like PCR or ELISAs, but there are some organism or sample-specific exceptions. So milk, for instance, can be frozen. We can freeze samples that are going to be tested for Listeria monocytogenes. And as we'll talk about later in class, that's actually a great way to enrich for these organisms. Now, freezing may sound like something that we have to do very deliberately, but in cold climates like Western Canada, where people working in agricultural practice may be quite some distance from the lab, it's certainly possible that we can have samples freeze in the back of the truck. When you suspect a bacterial infection, make sure to obtain cultures before administering antibiotics. Collect the sample and then treat. Otherwise, we have problems of interpreting negative results. So if the sample was collected after you gave the drug, is the negative result because there is no bacterial infection? Or is it negative because the antibiotic has already had its activity and inhibited the growth of the organisms? I would really encourage you to make smears in addition to cultures. This is a cheap and quick adjunctive test that can be done in-house. And gram staining specifically is a very, very useful addition. Knowing whether an organism is gram positive or gram negative can help guide your therapeutic selection. And as you'll see throughout the course of this class, bacterial morphology can help you to come up with a preliminary etiological diagnosis that can also impact therapeutic selection. Labeling is very, very important. You need to make sure that samples are labeled uniquely and unambiguously, and then to fill out the sample requisition form as completely as possible. Here we have an example form from the diagnostic lab at the Western College of Veterinary Medicine. And the first thing I want to highlight is that it's important to give a complete history plus a suspect diagnosis. This lets the lab know what the most appropriate media are. So many organisms require specialized or sort of non-routine culture methods, and blood and McConkey simply may not cut it. If there's something in particular that you're looking for, certainly let them know if you suspect some unusual organism. And also consider what tests you want to run. Is serology or culture more appropriate in this particular context? If you're working up a case for a disease that you're not experienced with and you aren't sure about the best diagnostic strategy, contact the lab. They should be able to help you select the most appropriate assays from their test catalog based on your question and based on the situation in the farm or with the patients that you're dealing with. Make sure not to put yourself or others in danger. On that sample submission form, warn about suspect zoonoses. If this is a rabies suspect, that's really important information to tell the lab. And second, don't request dangerous tests. If you suspect a systemic mycoses, which we'll talk about in our dimorphic fungi lecture, don't request a culture. This is a level 3 organism when grown in its mycelial phase and can put laboratory workers in harm's way. So here in Western Canada, what diagnostic labs might you use? In British Columbia, we have True North Diagnostics, which is a primarily companion animal lab in Langley, BC, as well as the Animal Health Branch Lab in Abbotsford, focusing more on agriculture. In Alberta, we have the Diagnostic Services Unit at the University of Calgary Veterinary Medical College, Prairie Diagnostic Services here in Saskatoon, the Veterinary Diagnostic Services Lab in Winnipeg, again, focusing more on agriculture. And then we have large multi-center commercial labs like IDEX and Antech. When shipping your samples, you need to keep some important safety regulations in mind. It's actually your responsibility to ensure that samples are shipped appropriately. As a general principle, you want to have your sample in a primary watertight container. So this could be your swab and the swab tube. It could be a tube of blood. It could be any sort of primary sample device. You want to surround that primary container with absorbent material, something like paper towel or cotton wadding. Surrounding that all in a secondary watertight container, which could be as simple as a Ziploc bag, and then packaging the whole thing in sturdy outer packaging to ensure that it isn't damaged during shipping. I put some links here to both Canada Post and FedEx, where you can get more information on their requirements for shipping clinical samples. Once the sample is received, processing can start in the lab. So this is where the diagnostic process, we enter that analytical phase, and it becomes the lab's problem. So the sample is accessioned, it's put into the laboratory information system, and it's processed probably in a biosafety cabinet. From here, likely smears are made, stained, visualized, and that allows a preliminary report to be generated. So for instance, gram-negative rods were seen in the urine sediment. The samples are then cultured for 18 to 24 hours. Any bacteria that are grown are identified by MALDI-TOF. Susceptibility testing is then done, another 18 to 24-hour incubation period, and then we get our final report. So it is a time-consuming process. We have at least 2 full days of incubation, if not 3. So you're looking at a minimum of 48 to 72 hours from when the sample is received until you get your final report. Ultimately, the goal of diagnostic microbiology is to help guide therapeutic selection. And so antimicrobial susceptibility testing is very, very important. We talk a lot about susceptible versus resistant organisms, and I think it's really important to define what this actually means. So this designation is designed to be clinically predictive. If we use drug X to treat an infection caused by a susceptible organism, and that drug is used according to its label indication, we are likely to have clinical success. If we use drug X to treat an infection caused by a resistant organism, according to its label indication, we are unlikely to have clinical success. So it's all about viewing the susceptibility of an organism through the lens of the patient. What is our outcome likely to be? It's really important to understand the products you used. What are they actually labeled for? What species are they labeled for? And what are the dosing recommendations? So here we have a monograph for clavaceptin, amoxicillin with clavulanic acid. And you can see that in dogs, it's labeled for the treatment of gingivitis associated with periodontal infections caused by susceptible bacteria. In cats, it's labeled for skin and soft tissue infections and abscesses caused by Pasteurella staph and strep, and it's recommended to be dosed at 12.5 mg per kg twice per day. What all of this means is that if you're using this product for any indication other than is on the label, the predictive power of that susceptible versus resistant designation is lowered. And that could be lowered to your benefit. You may actually be using the product in a way that it's more likely to be successful, or you may be less likely to have clinical success.